Hi boys and girls, good morning or afternoon depending on whenever you're watching this video. Today we're going to go ahead and be working on a worksheet that is analyzing figurative language. As you can see here, this is a worksheet that I have issued out in class, so you will be watching this video in class and you will go ahead and complete the worksheet. So we do have and we'll be learning about figurative language today. And we will also be examining understanding author's purpose. So these are two skills that are essential for the STAR test. So this is what we will be doing. Now, expectations for this worksheet. 1, you need to make sure you write your name at the very top. So that's the first thing I want you to do. I want you to go ahead and just create a little thing that says name with a line. And then you're going to write your first and last name there. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and put class period. Because when you turn this in, it makes it easier for me to sort it out and to see which class period this is. So if you're in my homeroom, second period, you'll put second period. If you're in Miss Escobedo's homeroom, you'll put third period. If you're in Mr. Valdez's homeroom, you'll put fourth period. And of course, if you're in Miss Guerra's homeroom, you will put fifth period. Go ahead and do that now. First and last name and your class period. Alrighty, so as we continue, we're going to go ahead and be needing a highlighter. If you don't have one, you can grab one in the back of the classroom. You may borrow one, but please make sure that you return it. Second thing you're going to be needing is a pencil. So please make sure you have a pencil. If you want to go ahead and take notes in pen, that's fine. But when you have to answer specific questions like this, I would prefer you use a pencil just in case you make a mistake. So please go ahead and gather the materials you need, which is a highlighter and a pencil at this time. Now, let's go ahead and get started. You're going to go ahead and use your highlighter, and we're going to be reading this first section right here. You can either read along with me, you can read it by yourself, or you can pause the video to focus and actually understand or highlight whatever it is you need to do. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with reading. It says, authors use figurative language to accomplish specific purposes. Figurative language is the author's use of words in an unusual or creative manner. So that's important right here. Authors like to use figurative language to be creative. Examples of figurative language include metaphors, which we've talked about, similes, which we've talked about, personification, which we've talked about, and hyperboles, which we've also talked about. So if you don't remember us talking about this in class, then it's a really good thing that I'm going over it because these are specific terms that you do need to know for the STAR test. Authors use figurative language to influence or communicate meaning within the text. So why do they use figurative language? Well, they're essentially trying to influence or communicate specific meaning within a text. When an author wants to communicate a thought or idea, he or she may not always communicate it directly, and that is true. We've talked about this before. That is a huge part of figurative language when someone is trying to say something, but they're trying to say it indirectly, meaning that they're not saying it directly. They're saying it in a specific or sarcastic way sometimes. To make the text more interesting for the reader, the author will use different forms of figurative language to communicate his or her ideas. Now, here's a check-in activity. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to think of a favorite example of figurative language from maybe a book, from maybe a movie, or from maybe a television show. This piece of figurative language can be any of these. It can be a metaphor that you've heard before. It can be a simile that is familiar, you're familiar with. It can be personification. Maybe you've watched a movie that uses a lot of personification, or it can be an exaggeration, a hyperbole of some sort. So you're essentially going to think about your favorite example of figurative language, and it can be from a book, a movie, or a television show. It may be one that is so vivid that it left a lasting impression on you. I want you to describe it in your mind, and then you're going to write it down. How did this better help you understand what the author was trying to communicate? So, that is the essential question. It's wanting you to write an example of figurative language that you've seen in a book, a movie, and it wants you to also answer the question of how did it help you understand what the author was trying to communicate. So, I want you to take a moment to try your best to think of an example, right? Obviously, do not come ask me for help. I want you to pause the video. I want you to think about it. And then I want you to write it down. That's exactly what I'm going to do as well. Now, there's many examples that we can think of. The easiest I can think of at this moment, right, if you're having trouble with thinking, you can think about movies that are simple. Movies where we have animated characters that are toys or maybe objects that talk and show human characteristics. So think of an example of that if you're having trouble and you can't really think of an example of figurative language. Now, I want you to answer this question. For example, when we think about the movie Toy Story, right, where the toys talk and they run and they dance and they're trying to get back to the main character Andy's house, right? That is an example of personification. Why? Because we're giving these toys life, right? Well, in the movie, they're giving them life. And we know that toys can't do that in real life. So that is an example of personification. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use an example from one of my favorite poets. Her name is Emily Dickinson. She once wrote a quote in one of her poems that said, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." That's an example of personification because this specific quote is giving death human characteristics. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. I'm going to start with my capitalized letter, which is exactly what I want you to do. Obviously, you should be writing your own example, but if you couldn't think of one, then this is why I'm here to help. So I'm going to put in one of the most famous examples of personification in poetry comma, I'm going to write my artist or my poet, Emily Dickinson. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my textual evidence, which is a quote. She says, I'm going to put that in red so that you are able to see it clearly. Because I could, and notice how I'm capitalizing my lowercase I. Please make sure you do that. We do not want any, please make sure you capitalize the higher case I because we don't want any lowercase i's there. Because I could not stop for death, and then this is my stanza break. This is where I'm moving to the next line, my line break. I'm moving to the next line, right? So that's what that indicates, and I'm going to capitalize he kindly stopped for me. Now, I want you to notice here, boys and girls, notice how this is coming from a poem. So some of you might be asking, well, Miss, why did you start this sentence with the word because, right? I thought you said we can't do that, which is true. I have said before that you're not supposed to start with this word because it's not an appropriate way to start a sentence. But you also have to think about this. This is coming from a quote, a poem. So it's different. The rules apply differently when it's coming from a poem. This is the first line from the poem, and then I have my line break, and then I'm moving to my second line in that poem. Okay, so notice how we are giving human characteristics to death. Because I could not stop death, he kindly stopped for me. Notice how we're using this pronoun he to describe death. So, what does this mean? Well, this essentially means that death is given human characteristics to illustrate that we do not necessarily choose when we get to die. So this is an example that I decided to choose because Emily Dickinson is one of my favorite poets, and this was just an example that stood out to me. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of just elaborate a little bit more. This gives death human characteristics. To illustrate that we do not get to choose when we will die. Now, this right here is an example of a type of figurative language, which was which one? Well, personification. This was the one I decided to use. So, you are able to create your own example, but for whatever reason, if you're having trouble or you don't know what to write, then you can just go ahead and write what I wrote and use my example. Let's move on to the next practice. Here we're going to build skills. So look at the following instructions. It says, on the STAR test, you will be asked about figurative language, which is 100% true. You will need to analyze its effects in a story. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to match each word on the left with its definition. So here are the types of figurative language. This is the left side and this is the right side. So let's go ahead and look at the first one. We have a simile, we have a personification, we have a metaphor, and then we have a hyperbole. You should know the difference and you should be able to complete this on your own. So what you're going to do with your pencil is you're going to look for simile and then you're going to look for its definition. Well, what is a simile and what does it do? Ask yourself that question and answer it silently to yourself. What is a simile and what does it do? Well, if you looked over here and you said, oh, a simile, that is when we compare two things using like or as. If you said that, then that's exactly what I want you to pair simile with. Just like that. Obviously, don't just be watching this video and getting the answers because you won't learn anything like that. You have to actually ask yourself the question and complete the exercise by yourself. So let's look at the next one. Personification, one we just talked about. I want you to look over and try it and find its definition and match the definition to the word personification. Go ahead and take a few seconds to do that now. If you went ahead and said that personification is human traits to non-human things, then you're correct. Personification would then be matched right over here to this definition. Now, move on to the next two. A metaphor. A metaphor is either a figurative comparison of two things or A metaphor is an overstatement of ideas for emphasis. Take a couple of seconds to try and figure out the definition for metaphor. If you said that a metaphor is a comparison of two things, then you are correct. Notice how a metaphor and a simile are almost exactly the same, but a metaphor, you can compare anything with anything, and a simile, you have to use the words like and you have to use the word as. Okay? And then, of course, a hyperbole is when we exaggerate. It's an overstatement where people kind of exaggerate for emphasis, to emphasize something is happening. Okay, so your paper so far should look something like this. Let's move on to the next page. Now, guided practice. This I'm just going to go over very quickly because you are going to have an exercise that you're going to have to complete on your own, which is the independent practice. So right now we're on the guided practice. Make sure you're on this page, page 40. Okay, so I'm going to go over it really quickly. What I want you to do during this time, I want you to make sure you have that highlighter ready and that you're following along in this video and you're actively listening. Whatever I highlight, you highlight. Whatever notes I take, you take. So let's get started. On the STAR test, you will be asked how the author's use of figurative language, such as a metaphor and personification, achieve specific purposes. Question 1 comes from the Marfa lights on page 13. You obviously don't have Marfa lights, and that is okay. But the real important thing is we're going to be examining how the author uses figurative language, such as a metaphor and personification in this example. So I'm going to read this stanza to us, which is coming from the Marfa lights, and it's just a short stanza, so I'm going to read that to us at this time. It says, like car lights winding up and down Alpine, switchbacks, except there are no roads out there, let alone mountains. Lights slashing like kids' sparklers on the 4th, fluorescent yo-yos, knife thrust stars, strobe lit, pogo sticking straight at us, leapfrogging the ghostlier. I want you to go ahead and notice this question. Why does a poet use figurative language in lines 16 through 21 to describe the lights? Well, right here we have 21, 19, 18, 17, 16. So right here in this stanza, what are they essentially trying to do? Well, let's look at keywords here. We're talking about like car lights winding up and down Alpine, switchback, except there are no roads out there, let alone mountains. Lights slashing like kids' sparklers on the 4th, they mean like the 4th of July. Fluorescent yo-yos, knife thrust star, strobe lit, pogo sticking straight at us, leapfrogging the ghostlier. Okay, well, let's check. We know that the answer is C because this tells us that the lights are a mystery and thus are difficult to describe or define. So notice how they are talking about the lights and they're describing the lights. They're comparing the lights to sparklers on the 4th of July, fluorescent yo-yos, those yo-yos that are very colorful, strobe lights, pogo sticking straight at us. So they're describing lights. They're describing them as a mystery. Notice how they also say, except there are no roads out there. So think of an area that has no roads whatsoever. It's going to be a mystery. Now, thus are difficult to describe or define. So notice how the author is trying to describe the lights, but in a mysterious way. So a start strategy that we can do, right? When the question references a specific paragraph, we always want to make sure that we go back. Teachers have told you this many times before. Some students do it, some students don't, but it is very important that we always go back into the poem or the passage and reread whatever lines they want us to go to. Okay? Then we want to identify that purpose. Like, what is the purpose of line 16 to 21? What are they trying to tell me? So that's where you got to ask yourself the question, okay, what was this talking about? And obviously, right, I didn't only read it one time, I had to read it a couple of times to understand what it's trying to say. And even then, I don't understand 100% of what it's trying to say, but I know it's trying to describe lights. Okay? Then, of course, you want to make sure you reread the answer choice. So, it's asking us to underline the evidence from the lines that support the answer to letter C, which I kind of did already, right? We know that it's talking about the lights, which is right here, lights, and it describes them as, it describes them to sparklers, it describes them to colorful yo-yos, it describes them to stars and strobe lights. And then it also kind of gives us this part where it says, except there are no roads out there. So this is the part where it's kind of giving me that mystery vibe. So your paper should look something like this. Let's move on to the independent practice part. The independent practice part is asking us to essentially read Braving the Cold. We're going to read this, right? And you're going to do this by yourself. You're going to read this, Braving the Cold, and then you're going to answer the following questions, okay, which are going to have to do with figurative language. Once you answer your questions, notice how it wants you to analyze your thinking. It wants you to explain the reason for your choice of answer number 3. Why did you choose whatever answer you chose here? Okay, and then once you finish that, check out. This is kind of like your exit ticket. It's asking you what purpose does the author use figurative language, and what does it accomplish in this passage? So notice how all these questions right here are going to relate right back to this. So if you don't understand this the first time, if you read it one time and you don't understand it, you have to read it until you understand what it's trying to talk about, because then how are you going to answer these if you don't even understand what this was? Okay, so I'd like you to pause the video at this time, and I want you to take some time to work on this. Once you're obviously ready to come back, right, once you finish answering all this and I see your strategies, perfect, then I want you to keep watching this video. So go ahead and pause at this time, work on that independent practice, and once you're ready to move on, come back and press play. Alrighty, so if you're back, I'm assuming that you already finished your independent practice and you're now watching to understand what the answers are and why. So let's go ahead and get started. Braving the Cold. The lake was like a fresh melted Arctic iceberg. The cold shot up from Tamara's toes throughout her body the instant she put her feet in the water. The lake looked so inviting that Tamara hadn't resisted the temptation to venture in, but the shock of the cold water quickly changed her mind. Tamara looked across the glistening water that beckoned her to risk the cold. The sunshine on the water made a promise of warmth that it couldn't keep. It had not reached the depths of the lake this early in the season. Question 2. What purpose does the author's use of figurative language in the first sentence accomplish in the first paragraph? Well, when we look at that first sentence where it says, the lake was like a freshly melted Arctic iceberg. When we think of Arctic, I want you to think of like the Arctic Ocean, where there's essentially located around the North Pole, and in that area it's very, very cold. Okay, so obviously we can see that because as Tamara kind of went into the water, her toes touched the water and she instantly felt that like cold feeling, right? The cold shot. So notice that. So this is supposed to kind of give us that understanding that this water was super cold. Not just your normal cold, like freezing cold, because they are describing it to a freshly melted Arctic iceberg. An iceberg meaning like a huge piece of ice that's in the ocean that essentially melts and stays cold. Okay, so what was the author trying to accomplish in that first sentence? Were they trying to give the reader more details about how the lake looked? Were they trying to give the reader a better understanding on how the water felt? Were they trying to give the reader a clearer picture of Tamara's location? Or were they trying to give you some type of information about how she felt? Well, if I were a student, the first thing I would do is definitely process of elimination. They're not talking about how it looked, and they're not trying to tell us about her location. Those are two that, are not that great of an answer. Let's read it one more time. The first sentence, what is it trying to accomplish? The lake was like a freshly melted Arctic iceberg. The cold shot up from Tamara's toes throughout her body the instant she put her feet in the water. Okay? Are they trying to tell you and give you a better understanding of how the water felt? Or are they trying to give you some information about how she felt? So it's either how the water felt or how Tamara felt, based on the first sentence. Well, boys and girls, it's very simple, right? If you use your common sense and your context clues, and you go back and read and you ask yourself, what is the author? Not what do I think? No, what is the author trying to do when they use this type of figurative language? Well, they're essentially trying to describe and give you a mental image on how the water felt, how cold it was, how it made Tamara's body feel. But it did only ask about the first sentence. It did not ask about the second. It only asked about the first. So it's trying to give you a mental image with words on how the water felt. So if you put letter G, you are correct. And if you didn't, that's fine. That's why I'm making this video, so that you can learn and so that you can correct your mistakes. So go ahead. If you went ahead and put G the first time, put a check mark, you got it right. And if you didn't, erase it with your pencil. That's why you're writing with a pencil, right? Erase it with your pencil and correct it. Next question. Why does the author use personification to describe the lake? Well, I hope you wrote on the side what personification means. And if you didn't, well, that's exactly what I want you to do, right? Because on the first page, it tells us right here, personification is when we assign human traits to non-human things. So I'm going to just put that here. When we give human characteristics, write it down please, to non-human things. And write it neatly too. Just right there in that question, just like that is fine. So I want to know why the author used personification to describe the lake. Well, let's see. Where does the author give human characteristics to the lake? That's what I want you to ask yourself. One more time. Here's a question. I want you to look at this right here, right? This paragraph. And I want you to underline where the author gave human characteristics to the lake. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I want you to actually underline it. Look at this paragraph and underline where they gave human characteristics to the lake. I obviously know what the answer is, but I want you to actually find it on your own. And if you already found it, wonderful. I want you to notice where the author tells us right here. They explain right here it tells us how Tamara looked across the glistening water that beckoned her to risk the cold. The sunshine on the water made a promise of warmth that it could not keep. We also see here where we give Tamara looked across the glistening water. Glistening meaning like the shiny and sparkling water that beckoned her to risk the cold. That basically like asked her to come in. It was inviting her to come in. So notice here when we have the water beckon her, it's basically asking her to come in, and it's also telling us that the sunshine made a promise that it could not keep. We know that this lake and this sunshine cannot make promises, right? So that is a human characteristic. Only humans can make promises, not a lake and not a sunshine. So notice how the author is giving personification to the water and to the sun, and how it's inviting and wanting Tamara to come in. So our correct answer right here, right, would be that it helps the reader understand why Tamara was tempted. Why? Because the water was glistening, it was sparkling, it was pretty. It was inviting her to risk the cold, kind of like telling her to come into the water. The sunshine on the water made a promise of warmth that it could not keep. So our correct answer here was letter D. Tamara was tempted. It gives us that understanding on why she wanted to go in so bad, because she was tempted. She thought the water was really nice. It was very sparkly and shiny, and it had this inviting look that tempted her to go in. Now we have to explain, right? So if you did this part, wonderful. I hope you wrote something like this with a capitalized letter at the beginning, right? I'm going to put the author. And if you did not fill this part in, you should have, but go ahead and write down what I'm writing if you did not fill it in on your own, which you should have, right? You shouldn't be copying my answers. This is just to help you to see if you're on the right track. The author writes that the water, and this is where I'm going to add my textual evidence, beckoned her. Basically like invited her in. It tempted her. And that the sunshine, and this is where I'm going to add my other piece of evidence right here, my quotation marks, and I'm going to put made a promise. I'm going to use my ellipsis to elaborate on this right here. Obviously, right, it tells us that the water made a promise. And I'm going to just skip this part, and I'm going to put it could not keep. So that's why I'm using my ellipsis, because I'm not going to write down the whole quote. I'm just going to add two pieces that are within the same sentence, but I don't want to write everything. So that's why I'm using my ellipsis. And then I'm closing my quotation marks. Okay, so make sure that you have quotation marks here, because that is my textual evidence, and I'm going to highlight that, and I would like you to do that too. That's my textual evidence, my first piece, and then this was my second piece of textual evidence right here. Notice how I have my quotation marks. I wrote down my quote. I use my ellipsis because I'm shortening the quote, and then I continued the quote right over here, and then I closed it using my quotation marks again. Am I done there? No, I still have to continue explaining. So I'm going to just continue explaining. Make sure you capitalize the T for Tamara. And make sure you have your punctuation. So the question says, explain your reasoning for your answer choice to question 3. Use evidence from the selection to support your answer. The author writes that the water beckoned her, that's my textual evidence, and that the sunshine made a promise that it couldn't keep. That's my other piece of textual evidence. To help the reader understand why Tamara was tempted to go into the water or in the water, okay? So notice, boys and girls, whenever they say use evidence from the selection to support your answer, you have to be writing textual evidence. And notice how I highlighted my textual evidence. I didn't only include one, I had 2 pieces. One, which is the top, and then the second one right here. Now, next question. What purpose does the author's use of figurative language accomplish in Braving the Cold? So what did the author accomplish with figurative language in this example? Well, figurative language helps the reader understand that the character really wanted to go into the water even though it was cold. But the way the author uses figurative language to describe the water is what changes her mind. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put the figurative language right because it's asking us what purpose does the author's use of figurative language accomplish? What did it accomplish? So I'm going to start my sentence with putting the figurative language helps the reader understand. And if you didn't write a complete sentence like this, right, if your paper has a lot of space in the line where you left stuff blank, then yes, I need you to write this down. Okay, so just the way I'm helping you answer this, if you did not do this the right way, then you need to erase what you have, and you have to make sure that you do this the right way because it will be for a grade. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop there. I've ran out of time, but hopefully we'll be able to continue the rest of this lesson tomorrow. I hope you learned something about figurative language, and I hope that you have these notes because this will be for a grade. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will be more than happy to answer any that you have. Thanks for watching.